Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. And I'll get started with a question for Brandon. For those in the audience who aren't as familiar with Humans of New York and this series in particular, can you describe this series for us a little bit? And if there are any passages that you'd like to read to help kind of bring it to life for us?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for everyone who made it out on this Friday night. So I guess to orient anyone who isn't familiar with Humans of New York, over the past 15 years, I've stopped about 10,000 random people on the streets of New York City, but also all over the world. And the blog really became known for random stories of regular people on the streets. And, as part of that, I traveled to 40 different countries. One of the first countries, the first country that I ever traveled to and did this work internationally, and the only country I've been to twice is Iran. So I have been, in Tehran and Isfahan, with translators, stopping random people on the streets and telling their stories. So I always had a kind of strong attachment to Iran because of that reason. And one of the things that I started doing on Instagram, Humans of New York's mainly on Instagram and social media. And there's one thing that I kind of figured out a few years ago that I figured out, and I'll kind of pull up my screen here. I figured out how to. Oh, okay, I'm going to actually show you on my phone. Um, uh, One thing that I did is I've kind of learned how to tell long form stories over individual social media posts. And as you can see, this is you can see about 10 different pictures of Mr. Zafari, who's next to us. And so what I will do is with each social media post, I will tell a chapter. And I have gotten to where I can tell about 30 to 40 to 50 chapters online over the course of a period of time and actually tell about a 20,000 word story on social media in a way that a lot of people will read and consume. And so when the protests started about a year ago, I was kind of in the back of my mind looking for some Iranian stories to share, so that I could, support the movement with some voices and some stories. And that is when I call him Bub John. He's in the program. He's Parwiz Zafari, but I met him through Rostam, his grandfather. So I've never called him anything, or his grandson. So I've never called him anything else but Bub John. And I actually initially started interviewing Bub John, and I was only going to tell a one-part story, which is about a single Instagram post. And when I started to learn about this man, his life, I mean, first of all, I've never met somebody who has loved a country more than this man loves Iran. I've spent about 90 hours, 100 hours, so it's just a ridiculous amount of time interviewing Bub John. And every time he gets emotional, it's when he's talking about country, when he's talking about ideals, when he's talking about patriotism. And he, one of the first and most noticeable things that struck me about him was he was the most passionate reader of Shahnameh. And he loved this book more than anyone I've ever seen love a book. He'd memorized thousands of verses. And as I started interviewing him, I learned about his life as a parliamentarian and learned all about Shahnameh. I started to see all the ways that his life and Shahnameh and the current history in Iran wove together into kind of a tapestry. And I saw this as, as an opportunity to tell a story in long form that I think, really kind of could get at, what the heart of Iran is and what it means, especially at a time when, I think the identity of Iran is being discussed and debated so much. One of the things that really fascinated me is like not only what is Iran, but what is a country? Is it a story? Is it a border? Is it a land? Like, what is it? And especially at this moment when the identity of what is Iran is being debated so much. And so that's what the story is about. It was told over a week in 54 chapters. And I'll just read, just two of those chapters just to kind of give an idea of the scope of the story. And the story actually opens in a kind of cinematic way 3,000 years ago, with Ferdowsi. So I will read that. We begin in darkness. A siren screams. The invaders come from the desert in a cloud of dust. The king gathers his army at a mountain castle. A single battle decides our fate. The battle burns, the din of drums, the clash of axes, the spark of swords. The dirt turns clay with blood. The sun goes down on a fallen flag. The day is lost. The king is gone. Our people are left defenseless. The only weapon we have left is our voice, so they come for our words. Scholars are murdered, books are burned, entire libraries are turned to dust, until nothing remains, not even memories of who we were. Silence. The sun comes up on a night galloping across the land. He summons the teachers, the scholars, the authors, the thinkers. He tells them to gather the words that remain, the books, the scrolls, the letters, the verses, everything that escaped the burning pits. Then he summons the sages, the keepers of our oldest myths from before the written word. He copies their stories onto the page. And when all has been gathered, all of the words, only then does he summon a poet. It had to be a poet, because poetry is music. It sinks into the memory. And in this land of endless war, the only safe library is the memory of the people. It is said that at any given time there are 100,000 poets in Iran, but only one is chosen, a single poet for a sacred mission. Put it all in a poem. Everything they're trying to destroy. The entire story of our people. Our kings, our queens, our castles, our banquets, our songs and celebrations. Our goblets filled with wine, our roasted kebabs, our moonlit gardens, our caravans of riches, silken carpets, amber, musk, goblets filled with diamonds, goblets filled with rubies, goblets filled with pearls, our mountains, our rivers, our soil, our borders, our battles, our crumbled castles, our fallen flags, our blood, who we were, our culture, our wisdom, our choices, and our words, all of our words, 3,000 years of words, a castle of words that no wind or rain will destroy. However long it takes, put it all in a poem, all of Iran in a single poem, a torch to rage against the night, a voice to echo in the dark. And I mean, the symmetry in between that moment 3,000 years ago when somebody is being asked to preserve Iran during a time of darkness, and the symmetry between this moment in history and the moment of history that Mr. Zafari lived through as a parliamentarian, is just one of the threads that goes all through this piece. And with that being said, this last passage I'll read to kind of give you an idea of the scope of the story is the day that Mr. Zafari leaves Iran. On my final morning in Iran, I woke with the sun. The road climbed through the mountains, the same mountain range that ran through Nahavan. But in Nahavan, the mountains were green. Here, there was no life. The border was closed, so the road was empty, and every step felt like death. Ferdowsi once wrote, "You cannot escape what is written." I've always hated that quote. There's always a choice, no matter how dark it seems. Just do the next good thing. That's what I've always believed. If you just keep saying the next true thing, a path will open up. A way will appear. I thought we would get there. I thought we, as a people, were going to get there. I thought that every day we'd take a step closer. Every day there would be more schools, more hospitals, more justice, more freedom, more light, and we'd get closer to an Iran built on ideals, an Iran built on freedom, where everyone spoke, an Iran where everyone participated, where choices were made together using our wisdom. 3,000 years of choices, the story could not end here. But for me, there was only one choice left: leave and live or stay and die. Ferdowsi died a broken man. His only son had died, Iran had lost another war, and the Turks now occupied the country. And after 33 years of working on the Shahnameh, nobody cared when he finished. And after he wasn't paid for his work. When he died, he wasn't even given a proper burial. The local cleric wouldn't allow him to be buried in an Islamic cemetery, so they buried him in his garden. Nobody heard the story of his life. Nobody heard the story of his death. But he died with hope, because he knew that no matter what, no matter how deep they're buried in the ground, some words have wings. At the end of Shahnameh, he wrote, "I shall not die. These seeds I've sown will save my name and reputation from the grave."
Thank you, Brandon. Mr. Zafari, now that we've heard an example of the story, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about your life growing up in Iran, your work there, your life there, and also, as Brandon said, your journey leaving Iran and after, just to kind of set the stage a little bit.
نخست درود میفرستم به همه کسانی که صدای من رو میشنوند و سپاسگزارم از استاد گرانمایه دکتر میلانی که این جلسه رو فراهم کرده و زحماتی که بخش ایران شناسی اونجا کشیدن بسیار سپاسگزارم. من زاده نهاوندم. در سال 1935 تا کلاس نهم اونجا بودم، بعد ناگزیر شدم که برای کلاس‌های بالاتر که اونجا وجود نداشت برم به شبانه روزی البرز. پس از 3 سال درس خوندن که دیپلمم رو گرفتم به آلمان رفتم و در اونجا 2 رشته ماشین سازی عمومی و اقتصاد فنی ملی رو خوندم و پس از اون به ایران برگشتم.
So my father actually expressed his gratitude to the the Center for Iranian Studies at Stanford and Dr. Milani and the leadership and Ms. Parhot for moderating tonight's session. He was born in Nahavand, a small township in the western state of Iran at the Zagros Mountains. He attended school until the 9th grade because there was no high school in Nahavand. Then he moved to Tehran, where he attended the Alborz High School. And after finishing high school, he moved to Germany, where he studied mechanical engineering economics.
پس از رفتنم به ایران من نخست در کارخانه که در حال ساختن بود برای ذوب‌آهن که ما خیلی هم آرزوش رو داشتن، من در اونجا شروع کردم کار و 3 سالی که در اونجا بودم سعی کردم اضافه بر کار معمول روزانه از وقت بعدیم با علاقه‌مندان دیگری که اونجا پیدا کردم، میان مهندسان و کارکنان اونجا، با هم کارهای بیشتری بکنیم. چاپ یک نشریه‌ای که مطالب به دردخور کارکنان رو داشت و همچنین کوشیدیم که یک قانون استخدام خوبی برای ذوب‌آهن فراهم کنیم که از میان بهترین قانون‌های استخدامی جهان که به دستمون آمد بهترین رو انتخاب کردیم و چیزهایی هم بر اون افزودیم و این قانون استخدامی رو من بردم به مقامات تهران ارائه کردم و اونا هم قبولش کردم. در اونجا من یک کتابی در باره ذوب‌آهن که آرزوی بزرگ ملی بود از آغاز تا روزی که به کار افتاد نوشتم، ولی من خودم دیگه از اونجا رفتم و نمیدونم که سرنوشت اون کتاب و اونا به چه صورت شد. و بعد از اینکه آمدم تهران در واگن پارس که اونم بنیان گذاری میشد برای ساختن واگن‌های راهن و بعدم لوکوموتیو در اونجا بسازن، اونجا من در واقع معاون اون شرکت بودم که بنیاد کار رو گذاشتیم بر اساس بهترین شیوه های فنی روز از استفاده از زمین و هوا و نور و تکنولوژی هایی که لازم بود برای اون موقع. و من بعد از 1 سال که انتخابات پیش آمد کاندیدای نمایندگی نهاوند شدم که 40 ماه هم در این پست بودم. بعد انقلاب پیش آمد و من بعد از 1 سال و نیم ناگزیر شدم که ایران رو ترک کنم و با اینکه اجازه خروج قانونی نداشتم ولی از ایران در آمدم و به آلمان رفتم.
After completing his studies in Germany, he returned in the early 70s to Iran. My father worked at the steel factory in Esfahan for 3 years, where, among others, in a collaboration with many engineers and workers, addressed the human resources issues at the factory, which became actually the prototype of recruitment and admission to factories in Iran. Along that, he wrote a book about the history of the iron factory, how it came to fruition, with at that time influences both from the West and East. This book, he doesn't know what the fate was. It was not published, but it's somewhere. And in addition, he published a monthly journal for all the workers and engineers to let them know about what's going on within the factory and around the world in the industrial world. After those years, he moved back to Tehran, where he was the vice president of the manufacturing company for locomotives and wagons, and was in charge of signing the contract between the government of Iran at that time and the Austrian government. And that factory then is right now in production, the largest locomotive and wagon factory in the Middle East. Then he became a parliamentarian for 40 months, and he served there. I'll leave that for now. And until the revolution in February 79, after the revolution, he was not allowed to work. He was not allowed to leave the country, but 18 months later, he left the country over the mountains of the Zagros.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that story, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it a little bit later. Rostam, I wonder if I can ask you, I'm sure you grew up hearing your grandfather telling you stories about Iran. You also grew up familiar with Humans of New York. What was it like being behind the scenes and hearing your grandfather tell these stories to Brandon as he was putting together this series?
Yeah, that was a very surreal moment for me, largely because my grandfather was my hero since I was as old as I can remember. But Brandon was my favorite artist since I was 13 or 14. If you had asked me in middle school, if you asked my friends who your favorite artist was, they would have told that you, Kanye West or Drake or something like that. I would have told you Brandon Stanton, because his writing was, to me, it gave that much hope to the world. It gave people a different perspective, a different angle to look at things. And it was just very deeply human. He just stopped people in the streets and really got to know them. And for him to take that stop on the street with my grandfather, and as he said, it was supposed to be a short stop, but then he's like, hey, one more interview, let's do one more interview, and then 40 or 50 times later, we're still there at his feet, hearing these stories about Iran, about Shahnameh, about ideals, and I think it was one of the most special times of my life. Those several months together.
Great. Were there any parts of your grandfather's story that you hadn't heard before that came out in this conversation?
Yeah, there were so many little moments and even realizations of how history and mythology intertwine. The fact that the last great loss to the Arab invaders was in Nahavan, the Battle of Nahavan in 642 AD. That's where he grew up. That was an interesting one to me, where how his own father, even though he didn't really believe my grandfather had a chance of winning the election, said, hey, you can just, I can't give you much because I don't know the politics world, but I can let you loan, I can give you my Jeep. And that green Jeep, he, went, from village to village, and just advocated what he believed, and without any consideration of, I'm going to win this. I'm going to share ideas I think people need to hear. And then hearing the stories of how, people would come, at first, very few people would come, and then he would regularly show up in these towns, and suddenly, after weeks, you'd see shops closing down at 5 or 6 p.m. so people would come, and then lining up as far as the eye can see, waiting to hear him speak. And that was pretty special to get these little flashbacks into these moments of history.
That's great, thank you. And maybe that's a good chance to ask Mr. Zafari about, the role that the Shahnameh has played in his life and kind of what it means to him. If you've read the series, you've seen how much it's intertwined throughout the storytelling. So Mr. Zafari, if you can share with us kind of the importance of the Shahnameh to you and how you pass that love and interest down to your children and your grandchildren.
نقش شاهنامه در زندگی خودتون اگه میتونید تشخیص بدی که چجوری از کودکی تا بزرگی و تلویزیون هم این نقش رو شما بعداً به فرزندات و نوه‌هات رسوندید، ولی بلند حرف بزن.
شاهنامه نامه بزرگ ماست. به نظر من این شاید بزرگترین کتاب انسان باشه تا امروز روی زمین، از نظر محتوا و اثری که در تاریخ گذاشته. برای اینکه وقتی نگاه کنیم که چطور عرب‌ها به کشورهای مختلف ریختن و دین اسلام و زبان عربی رو بردن، ایران تنها کسی بود که از این زمین خودش رو بالا کشید و تونست زبان خودش و آیین خودش رو حفظ بکنه. یعنی بیشتر منظورم این است که فرهنگ ایرانی مستحیل نشد، از میان نرفت، بلکه از طریق فردوسی ما تونستیم که این فرهنگ رو جاودانه بکنیم، اینو کنسرو بکنیم، نگهش داریم و نسل‌ها از روش یادآور بشیم که چه بودیم، چه کردیم و چه اثری در جهان داشتیم. و داستان سرایی کلاً به نظر من خیلی گرامی‌تر حتی از فیلم سازی است که یک تکنولوژی خیلی جدیدتریه و اون این است که شما با تخیلات خودتون قهرمان‌ها رو می‌آفرید تو ذهنت. اون بازیگرانی نیستن که جلو شما روی دیوار هستن، بلکه شخصیت‌هایی هستن که بالاتر، وقتی که میگه که مردی بود که هیچ کس مانند اون در جهان پیدا نمی‌شد، این تصوری رو که هر کس برای خودش میکنه و واقعا نمیاد تصور یه آدمی رو بکنه که روی دیوار سینما دیده. این است که داستان نویسی یک ویژگی فوق‌العاده‌ای داره که میتونه آدم رو ببره به اون جایگاهی که یک قهرمان هست و یک اندیشه مطرح میشه و همه اون چیزی که در واقع در زمینه فرهنگ میشه به دستش آورد. شاهنامه ما اینو در بر داشت و من حس میکردم وقتی اینو میخونم نیرو میگیرم، قدرت میگیرم و آگاهی های بیشتری پیدا میکنم، به خودم اعتماد بیشتری پیدا میکنم. این است که دلبستگی فوق‌العاده بهش پیدا کردم و هرچه بر من گذشت و اطلاعات بیشتری کسب کردم دیدم که این نامه گرامیتر، پرارزشتر و ارجمندتر از اون چیزی هست که من پیشتر میدونستم.
So Shahnameh is not only the book of kings, but is the grand book. In my father's view, maybe the grandest of books, because it is the history of a people over generations, over years, their mythology, their epics, their actual history that has come from really from a generation to the other. And after the fall of the Sasanian Empire and the Arab invasion, Iran was only one land that did not get annihilated because of its language or culture, but the Iranian people kept their language and their traditions. And this was really mainly through the work of this farmer, Ferdowsi, who over 30 years collected and put it in verse, the history of the Iranian people from the dawn of history until the fall of the Sasanian Empire. And so when he grew up reading this only, it was not just for him history, but it gave him hope that there is light at the end of this dark tunnel. There is hope for a better world, because we have had times where the people were happy, the land was filled with joy, And so that's intertwining of the stories of Shahnameh has really been a main thing for him in his life. And he was saying that storytelling has a really probably much larger role than today the movies, because in movies you see actually with your eyes, but in storytelling you have to leave it with your imagination. You have to imagine the hero. You have to imagine the thought of a good and evil. You have to imagine what has happened during those times, and read with the poetry. So storytelling can go much deeper into your psyche than maybe images that you will see or hear from actual people on the screen.
Thank you so much. Brandon, if we could turn back to you, I wonder if you could share some of the challenges to writing this story. I think for a lot of Iranians reading it, they know how the story ends in a lot of ways, but in the way that you wrote it, you left suspense in it and really brought people back post after post. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about your process and any challenges you encountered.
Sure. Well, I mean, the the main new wrinkle was that it was in a foreign language. Rostam served as my interpreter, which I think was, very special to be able to, through the tongue of his grandson, learn about the life of this, great man. So at first it was, I don't know, how many hours of interviews did we do, Rostam? I mean, I think we round up to 100. And so it was gathering this entire life and then doing my homework, reading about Iranian history, because I mean, the beautiful thing to me, and as he said, he just talked about the Shahnameh so eloquently. The very interesting thing about Babjan is, his wife Mitra is a very important character in the story, and she describes herself as a realist. And one of her main complaints about her husband is that Babjan lives in a world of ideals. He lives in mythology. He lives in this ancient book where people only tell the truth, and they worship courage and duty to country. And the story of Babjan is the story of this. I mean, he is a 87-year-old man right now, but when he starts as this 11-year-old boy who grows up in this village in Iran, and he's just obsessed with this ancient book which tells about these ancient heroes of the country and what this country means, and him trying to live out these ideals in this government which is where free speech is not is not permitted, where there's no freedom of the press, and to get along you have to go along. And here, I think when he reads his resume and talks about the factories that he worked out, and then he says it's 40 months at the parliamentarian. That story is 40 months. A man who's devoted to speak up whenever he sees injustice. Devoted to telling the truth whenever he sees it, and living out this very ancient way of life that came to him from this book 3,000 years ago as to what he understood Iran means in the reality of a fallen world and a world where compromises need to be made. And so that's really what hooked me. I mean, it's when you listen to him talk about his LinkedIn resume, I think it's this man is he doesn't profess to worship any god with a capital G, but he worships truth. And so this is a man who morally and spiritually taught me so much, because he taught me that truth is something that you do. All of these lessons that he took from this ancient book, the Shahnameh, as to what he believes it meant to be an Iranian, he lived every single step of the way. So my joy, I told Rostam, I go, no matter how many people read the story, whatever, this is the story that has changed me the most. And it's because I've never met a man who lived his ideals as strictly and as devotedly as Mr. Zafari. And he got exiled because of it. He paid a lot of consequences because of it. And so that is, that was what excited me about the story. And, that's what I hope people take away from it.
Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of reactions to the series, I wonder what you thought of the reactions and if there were any that were surprising online in terms of comments or virality.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like I don't think the longest story, this was a 20,000 word story told over Instagram. I definitely don't think anyone's ever attempted it before. The longest one that I'd ever told before, which I think was the longest story ever told on Instagram and Instagram history, was 32 chapters, and this was 54 chapters. It dealt with 3,000 years of Iranian history. You talk about the challenges. I had to, orient everybody with the Shah and the what it was like to live in 1970s Iran and the revolution and the Islamic Revolution. So there's so much history and politics and the 3,000 years of history and mythology. I've never had to keep so many balls in the air. And so many people came along on the journey. It was, so beautiful to read the comments and to read, especially, the comments from Iranians who recognized the Iran that they knew, which was my greatest challenge, even though I'm serving as Mr. Zafari's tongue and trying to interpret him. There had to be so much context and so much history and poetry and philosophy and mythology, and to get it all in a way, in a form where Iranians were coming up to me and talking to how much it resonated with their view of Iran and their own experience of things was very meaningful to me.
I think there was definitely in the comments a lot of pride from Iranians in hearing this story told, but there was also a lot of appreciation from non-Iranians saying how much they appreciated the nuance and kind of the human side of the story and how little they felt like they knew about Iran and Iranians from what they got out of the media or out of their school books. So I thought that was interesting to see in the comments. I wanted to read one comment from one of the posts. Someone said, "Isn't it remarkable that a young man who once posted a blurry portrait of a green lady years ago should have arrived at this moment, sharing the hopes, dreams, and sorrows of one of the oldest nations on earth to tens of millions throughout the world." And I think that reflects a lot of what Iranians thought as they saw this. I don't know, Rostam, if that resonates with you as kind of a young Iranian-American seeing a platform like Humans of New York share a story about Iran.
Yes, for me it was, having a story this length on Humans in New York, it's like, to me, it means a lot more than having it on like New York Times or something like that, because he's an artist. He's choosing to write what he writes about, and to make that kind of commitment. We're not talking about, oh, this is like, we're gonna run this headline for a day. We're talking about a year of this man's life. He's 40 years old. A year of his life to dedicate when he has, a beautiful wife, great kids. Like, to say, I'm gonna put a year of my life on hold and my priorities and to share this. That's a gift to take lightly. And I think Brandon has done more for Iran than most Iranians I know, and I personally feel so grateful to him for it, because I remember when he first started doing it, my dad, I think, rightfully expressed worries. He's like, what do you know about modern Iran history? Like, you know nothing about modern history, and you need to go read these 20 books. And I was petrified, because I was like, okay, Brandon's just gonna completely walk away, tail between his legs, like disheartened, like Eeyore style. And that man came back, read all 20 books, take notes on them, and I was so impressed, because I was on a trip for work or something, and I left, came back 3 weeks later, and my dad had said, "This man read all the books, he did all his homework, he knows more about Iran's history than you do. You should be ashamed of yourself." And I was so proud of him, and yeah, it was really cool to see him, and just
that was a proud moment for me as well. Okay, you said, yeah. What was the greatest challenge to overcome? Dr. Zafari's skepticism. That was the greatest challenge to overcome.
Brandon nicknamed my father the General during this whole process.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. And Mr. Zafari, I wonder if you had any hesitation, when you were first approached to tell your story and share it on a platform like this. Were you nervous? Were you not very excited to share your story? And then what did you think after it was done? The reactions on social media from your family and friends?
از من پرسه که شما چجور احساسی داشتی وقتی اول به برندن و رستم اومدن که شما به داستان تو بگو برای این شبکه‌های مجازی، آیا نگران بودی، حس عصبی بودی، استرس داشتی، چجوری میتونستی بکنی و بعد که پخش شد چجور شد، چه تأثیری گذاشت روی دوستان، خانواده، بیرون، بگه شما چجوری از اول شروع کردید تا آخر؟
بخت بزرگی بود که پیش آمد و این با بودن رستم و داشتن دوست گرانمایه‌ای مثل براندن که الان دوست عزیز منم هست، ما تونستیم در واقع با هم بشینیم و گفتگو کنیم و بسیار ساعتهای درازی داشتیم که من در واقع با اون کنجکاوی‌های بسیار هوشمندانه‌ای که براندن داره از ژرف‌ترین لایه‌های درونی منم پرسش‌هایی می‌کرد که من در واقع بیشتر خودم رو یک بار دیگه شناختم و بیرون کشیدم اونچه که واقعا در من خفته بود در این سالها و بیان کردم و اون با قلم شیوای خودش اینو آنچه را که خواست و با اون با توجه به خوانندگانش که اونا رو به خوبی میشناسه اونا رو برگزید و عرضه کرد به خوانندگانش که من واقعا از این لحاظ خوشبختم که میدیدم که چقدر این مورد پذیرش این خوانندگان قرار گرفته و چه بسیار کسانی که رفتن و گفتن که ما سفارش دادیم کتاب شاهنامه رو که خودمون بریم و بخونیمش و این واقعا یک خاطره بسیار دلانگیزی برای منه و فکر میکنم که بسیار بیشتر از اینم براندن در اختیارش هست اگر بخواد اونو به صورت یه تاریخ در بیاره. بسیار چیزهای دیگه هم برای گفتن داره، منتها اون شیوه کارش اینجوری بود که باید تیکه های کوچکی رو می آورد و به همین دلیل واقعا انتخاب درستی کرده به نظرم، چون من از نتیجهش و از کامنت هایی که روش آمد همه رو خوندم و واقعا لذت بردم.
My father is saying it was a delightful experience to have Rostam there with his friend Brandon, who became actually a grand friend of myself throughout this experience. And I feel really a privilege to call him a friend. And it was the genius of his curiosity and his questioning me. He would go into the deepest layers of my psyche and get the questions out of me that I probably didn't know I had it in me. And I got to know myself through Brandon as a new man again because of his intelligence and curiosity. And he made his own selection of those tens of up to hundreds of hours of interviews because he his audience through the years, and he made it the story that he wanted to tell. But there is probably so much more in those interviews that he can tap in to write much more about the history of Iran. So when I look back and look at the commentaries, and I read all the commentaries from the 54 stories, I was really delighted to see that many who didn't know Iran would comment that because of you, Brandon, we have gone to the bookstore and have bought the Shahnameh, and we are starting to read the Shahnameh.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. I want to keep an eye on the clock, and I want to make sure we have time for your questions. So maybe I'll just ask one or two more, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions. And we'll ask you to line up behind the mic in the aisle so that they can hear your audio and we can capture it. So Brandon, I did want to ask, for those who haven't followed the series, it was posted in the 6 days leading up to the 1-year anniversary of the death of Mahsa Amini. And I wanted to ask, why you chose to spotlight a man's story in the moment of time when we were sharing a lot of stories about women in a struggle that is primarily about women's rights in Iran, and if you received any feedback on that in the comments or after sharing the story.
It's actually it's a great question. It's actually a question we were asking ourselves in the run up to it. And the on the other side of that, the answer is no. Nobody really. And there might have been one or two comments, but I was I think appreciative and I admired that the audience kind of realized that the story of Babjan, and this is a story of freedom, and these ideals that are kind of being lived out right now are ideals that everyone can participate in. And I think one thing he was very insistent on all through the story is that right now it's a time to take a step back because the women are leading the way. And I think if it wasn't Babjan's own conclusion and his own belief that this was a moment for women, and that women were now carrying the torch that he had been trying to carry 40 years ago, then yeah, I think maybe it would not have been the right time to share. I actually one of the reasons was purely logistical. We were actually going to share this on Persian New Year. And the story got longer and longer and longer, and we were working on it every single day. And the story, or the anniversary of Mahsa Amini's death, was coming up. And I think this was a time when so many people were trying to get attention back on Iran and to kind of capture that momentum and that moment from a year ago. And knowing Babjan so much about his life, and when you read the story, is that so it's for him, it's all about, if everything I do, the sum accumulation of my effort and my story and all my life can move things forward for Iran even a centimeter, then I've done my duty. And so knowing how he views his life and his purpose, I thought that telling his story and using his story in a moment to try to add maybe 1 mile per hour to the tailwind of what people were trying to do over there seemed like the appropriate decision.
Thank you. Rostam, maybe my last question for you. As a young Iranian-American, what does the Shahnameh mean to you? How does your Iranian heritage kind of factor in your daily life and the work that you do?
Well, I'm lucky enough, I get to work with my cousin Sipanta. We have a foundation called Nimruz, focusing on cultural activism. Culture is a very dynamic and powerful force, and it's really important. I think we need to see a Iranian cultural renaissance across the world of young people tapping into their history, their poetry, their language. And I think we learned at the foot of our grandfather. And my grandfather talks about, actually one of the interviews with Brandon, he talked about how if you look at like a river, like the water passing are like the different generations of people. But what that kind of energy that moves a river, that is culture, right? And so for me, I think the more young Iranians can get together and find that unity in our culture and work together to celebrate, embrace, our own history, our own heritage, and use that as the mechanism to see the change we want to see, both in our own communities and in Iran. I think that's our calling in a way.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for questions. If anyone has a question and would like to stand up next to the mic and ask for any of our guests.
ببخشید من میخواستم از سرور مهندس ظفری خواهش کنم که علاوه بر اینکه تاریخ زندگیشون گفتن، راجع به فعالیت‌های سیاسیشون هم گفتگو میکردن و من خوشحال میشم که در اینجا جزء برنامه زندگیشون اون کوشش‌های سیاسیشون رو هم بگوین. ضمن اینکه من به سرور مهندس ظفری پاینده ایران میگویم و خودم را معرفی میکنم. من ضامنی هستم.
داستان بلندیه، تمام زندگی منو در بر میگیره. من از 16 سالگی از کلاس دهم وقتی آمدم ایران، از نهاوند آمدم تهران، در اونجا با فعالیت‌های سیاسی آشنا شدم و به حزب پانیرانیست پیوستم و در آلمان هم که بودم به همین صورت. نقطه درخشانی که باید بگم در این دوره آلمان، ما اونجا یک انجمنی درست کردیم به نام انجمن ملی کاوه و در اونجا فعالیت‌های گسترده تری داشتیم که پیش از اینکه ولی این سازمان تشکیل شد، در سازمان‌های دانشجویی بودیم که همون موقع من چند سالم نماینده سازمان بودم از کارلسروه. موقعی که مسئله انقلاب سفید مطرح شد، شاید اینو من جالب باشه بگم که من تنها کسی بودم در بیرون از ایران، میان تمام ایرانیای بیرون از ایران، که ایستادم و گفتم که این کار درسته، این اصلاحات ارضی، آزادی به زنان، سپاه دانش و اینا درسته، ما نمیبایست باش مخالفت کنیم، در حالی که دانشجویان چپ زده اون روز همه رفته بودن جلو سفارتخونه های کشورهایی که بودن و مخالفت کرده بودن. این نقطه درخشانی بود از اون مبارزات اون سالها. و بعد هم همین شاید مایه خشم اون نیروهای چپی بود که در کنفدراسیون گرد آمده بودن و اونا در 29 دسامبر سال 1969 به جلسه ای که ما 20 نفر هر هفته جمع می شدیم اونجا در کارلسروه و اونا کنگره سالانه رو در کارلسروه داشتن، نزدیک به 200 نفر به ما حمله کردند که من چشم راستم رو اونجا از دست دادم که اینا بر سر ما ریختن. این خاطرش بود. ولی بعد رفتن به ایران و فعالیت‌های حزبی منم ادامه پیدا کرد، چه در اصفهان که بودم در شهر محلی گرفتیم فعالیت میکردیم و همینجور وقتی به نهاوند شهر زادگاه هم میرفتم همین کار رو میکردم. و بعد که یک حزبی پیش آمد، خب دیگه فعالیت‌های حزبی من عیناً همونجور منتقل شد توی اون تک حزبی، برای اینکه اون تک حزبی هیچ مانعی برای من ایجاد نمی‌کرد. من همون آدم بودم و با همون ایدئال ها، با همون آرمان ها و با همون ایدئال و آرمان ها امروز هم اینجا هم هر جای جهانم که بودم اونا همراه منم.
So when my father moved from Nahavand to Tehran for high school, he joined in the 10th grade the Parwiz Party, where the movement for nationalization of oil was happening in Iran, and many know of Dr. Mossadegh here more so in the United States. But then he continued after in Germany. He became one of the founders of the Iranian Students' Confederation. But when the Confederation stood against the land reform and the white revolution that was happening in the Iran of the Shah regime, my father dissociated himself from the Confederation and said, no, I am for land reform. I am for women's rights that they can elect, and I am for the forces of education in Iran. So he then separated himself of the more leftist-oriented confederation and founded the National Resistance Organization of Kaveh, where 20 to 25 people would gather in the University of Karlsruhe in a room. And in December of 1969, 200 of those anti-Shah leftist students attacked that room of 25, and it became a major violent struggle, and my father lost his right eye during that political trauma. After that, my father went back to Iran, continued his work in the Parwiz Party until the Shah made the Rastakhi's party, where only there was one party. But my father never lost his ideals. He still continued with his ideals in this new structure, and then was active for the development of the villages and for the township. And when the revolution happened, he was one out of the 5 leadership council of the Parwiz Party. And when he had to leave Iran 18 months later, it was because several of his friends were accused of being part of a coup d'etat against Khomeini, and my father went into hiding. And then the story that Brandon so eloquently wrote, he had to leave over the mountains.
Hello, my name is Kevin. I grew up in Great Neck, New York, and Brandon, actually, about 5 years ago, you interviewed my rabbi, Howard Stecker. I'm curious, how are you able to formulate such questions to coax out of your interviewees the most salient parts of their life and their insights and really stare into their soul?
Oh, that's a very nice way of saying that, Kevin. Thank you. the so there's two different types of work that I do. There's kind of the long form where I will spend a long time with a subject like Dr. Zafari or Mr. Zafari, and the type of work that I think Kevin's asking about is I stop random people on the streets. And I think Humans of New York first got known for telling very intimate stories about random people on the street. And I think one of the questions I get a lot is how can you go from just meeting somebody to having them tell you some of the deepest and most nuanced things about their lives? And the answer I always give to that, Kevin, is it's not really a matter, it's not a methodology about asking the right questions. It's very much about an energy. If there's anything that I got good at over the past 10 or 15 years is in a very short amount of time, going from this kind of uncomfortable energy of approaching somebody on the street to, in a very short amount of time, getting to a place where they feel like they're having a conversation with somebody that they know, or somebody that they've known for been speaking with for a very long time. And really, it's not about saying the right thing. It's all just kind of about being present in the moment and very closely listening. I normally just have one or two or three questions that I go in with at first. One that I like to ask is, what is your greatest struggle right now? How has your life turned out differently than you expected it to? What's the biggest challenge that you've ever overcome in life? And then after that, it's very much being present and listening. All of the nuance that you were talking about comes out of follow-up questions. It comes out of following curiosity, and just being very curious to know about a person and understand about a person so that I can express it. And having done it, 15 years now, normally what I'm looking for when I'm interviewing somebody and I'm kind of talking about all the different, things about their lives is, what is the thing that this person can tell me that none of the 10,000 other people that I've interviewed have told me? And I found that a lot of times, people's particular genius and the thing that they're most able to express in an eloquent way is the thing that they've struggled with the most, because that's the thing that they've thought about the most. If a man has been divorced, he can speak about what it's like to get divorced in a very unique way. If a man's battled with addiction, he has some sort of insight or some sort of wisdom into addiction. So I find that if you can put your finger on the battle that the person has fought the hardest against, you will find the place in their life that they're able to give the most unique expression or the most unique story. And so that's sort of the process that I go through when I stop a random person.
I love that answer. I also think being a treasure hunter and being relentless, Brandon has faith that someone has a deep answer, whether they know it or not. And I can't tell you how many times he made me repeat asking a question for the 11th or 12th or 15th time in a row. And you know how weird it is to ask your grandfather the same question 15 times in a row? And then the 16th time, we had like the most amazing answer and breakthrough for the story. And yet the next time I still was like, Brandon, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I mean, he just trusts his process. And I think something I've heard him talk about as being a writer is like, you go to the same kind of journey every time, the pitfalls, the highs and lows. But when you're like a seasoned guy like him, it's going to pass. You just know it. It does not, it's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to feel dark. It's supposed to feel lonely. And just watching him do that, like, made me think about really having a process, no matter what your work is or craft is, and really building trust in that. So that was something I wanted to throw out, just to say he's just extremely relentless in those questions, and it always led to a better place.
Thank you. I think there was one more hand I saw in the aisle.
Thank you. To Brandon and the storytellers, I wanted to point out that the Shahnameh is indeed the world's longest epic poem and the longest epic poem created by a single author of 50,000 couplets. So I think it's only fitting, Brandon, that you would tell a story as the longest Instagram story ever. It seems to be that it was meant to happen that way because of what the Shahnameh represents. And I just do you think it would have been even possible to tell the story in any less words?
No, and I probably, the question is, did I give it enough space, in the format that I told it in? I was reading it through, and I don't know, for those of you who are artists or authors or writers in the audience, you'll know that a lot of times when you publish something, you just put it away, I read Bub John's story probably 500 times in the 9 months that I was working on it. Every morning, Rostam talks about my process. Every morning I wake up and I drink my coffee and I print out the draft from the previous day. So I'd read his story, hundreds of times, and so I actually hadn't read it since I published it until today. And yes, the thing that struck me the most was, all of the different threads, all the 3,000 years of history, all the characters, the politics, the history of Iran, that were being, woven together, and each one, being given enough of an examination where an audience could really understand the scope of what happened. I mean, Iran is one of the greatest stories ever told. I mean, and I think that's why so many people fall in love with it, and why it's such a tragedy that its image in the world right now. I think that's what really has drawn me so much to Iran. I think part of the work and part of my work that I take pride in is going to neighborhoods in New York City, where that may be known for their crime, or maybe the only news stories you ever hear about them are a shooting or a mugging, and find the mom that's trying to make it, or the young man who's trying to raise his little brother because his dad disappeared, and just finding kind of this soft underbelly and beauty in these places that have this single negative narrative coming out. And, I think why I fell in love with Iran so much when I went there was just the beauty and the warmth and the kindness of the people. And I picked this up in Iran. People, it's my go-to move now. When people would talk and cover your heart, I use it all the time now. Like, that's from Iran. It's just the warmth and the beauty of the people, and that discrepancy. Not only that, but how rich the history is, everything that you've contributed to the world, the poetry. I mean, the Rumi, Hafez, this is gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous stuff. And to have it all just be deduced into this pinpoint of, oh, that's the radical Islamic nation. You know what I mean? This single narrative. And to find a man like Bub John, where I could just, nobody's loved Iran more than this man. He's 10,000 verses he had memorized at one time, or thousands of verses he had memorized. And just, you've pulled the spool of this man, and more and more and more and more and more of Iran came out. And I saw an opportunity that through the story of a single man, which is what I'm good at telling. I was a history major, but I haven't told history or politics. I haven't written essays or nonfiction. That through the story of a single man, I could perhaps give some sort of breath or whiff or glimpse of the depth and beauty of this country. And did I bite off more than I could chew by having to keep all of those things in the air? I think we landed it pretty well. And it was a great honor of my life to take this journey. I mean, I learned so much about this country, and to sit at the feet of this man. He's taught me so much. His voice is always in the back of my head. Again, we can talk about the factories and his parliamentarian record, but I think the true beauty of this man is how much he's lived his ideals, how moral he is, his commitment to truth. And I never seen a man who lived what he believed as much as Bub John. And that will always be my takeaway from this story.
Hello, I'm from Sri Lanka. So if you're curious as to where else non-Iranians read this story, it was definitely a small island nation, small family, and we kept up with the stories. My question is that the stories cover really, really personal moments in life along with the political. And to Mrs. Zafari, was there any particular moment or aspect of the storytelling that was difficult to share?
درود بر شما. من هرگز برام سخت نبوده. من آنچه که زندگیم بوده واقعا فکر میکنم که میتونست روی صفحه تلویزیون باشه. من هیچ چیزی نداشتم که پنهان کنم، هیچ نقطه‌ای که ازش شرم داشته باشم. آنچه کردم با علاقه کردم و دوست داشتم در همون حد هم گفته بشه. هیچ اغراقی رو دوست ندارم. دوست دارم همیشه به اندازه‌ای باشه که واقعا هست، نه کمتر و نه بیشتر. و خوشبختانه داستان به همین صورت هم عرضه شده و من دوست داشتم که همه چیز رو بگم و بسیار چیزهای بیشتری هم هنوز هست که شاید منتشر نشده ولی هنوز هست.
He's thankful that you have followed Brandon's story from this beautiful island nation of Sri Lanka, and he says, "No, there was nothing that I felt I wanted to say and I didn't say, and it's much more that I have said is in those interviews that Brandon has, if he ever wants to publish those, and he has probably." He thinks he has more stories that would come out from now on as well. But no, he also said there is nothing that he always thought that if there would be a television camera, there is nothing in my life that I would hide. It is what it is, with all my faults and all the good stuff. It is there, so I am not ashamed of anything. It is my life, and this is what it is.
I will say that I think the trend of the thing that he was shyest about that took the longest. Rostam, at the very beginning, I'd say the first 60 hours of the 100 hours of interviews were all about politics and history. And I mean, one of the great things about Babjan, this story, for those of you who haven't read it, is it's a fantastic love story, and we haven't talked about that. Everything we've talked about has been Iran and mythology. This man had a lifelong relationship with a woman who he loved dearly and who loved him dearly. And it's one of the most beautiful love stories that you will hear. And that was the thing that Babjan was always the shyest to talk about. He was a man of few words. And when Rostam says that sometimes I had to ask Babjan 16 questions to get the 17th answer, a lot of times it was him talking about how much he loved his wife, because it was so gorgeous to see. You see it every single day. They're in the same room. They would go on walks and you could hear them giggling in the forest together. Even when you couldn't see them, you could hear him giggling. So it's like his love and his devotion for his wife was on display every single time I was over there. But whenever I asked him directly about it, 3 or 4 word answers. So the one of mine that goes back to Kevin's question of, you know, how do I get people to reveal? That was one I was extremely relentless on. And it was so funny because I was almost finished with the story when he finally started to open up about this great love story of his life. And so I went back and rewrote the whole thing just because it was too good. And we needed it as a break from all the history and politics. That's what I always joke. Mitra is the name of Rostam's grandmother and Mr. Zafari's wife. And I always say Mitra was our savior, because she gave us our lightheartedness and our love story. And she was a foil in so many ways to Babjan's obsession with ideals and politics and history. She loved beauty and life and dancing and socializing, which is another beautiful part of Iran. So the feminine half of our story, out of Babjan's sense of propriety and his respect for his wife. He was very slow to open and reveal, but me and I think everyone who read the story is so glad that he finally did.
Yeah, my question is a kind of a follow-up of what you're just saying. After hundreds and thousands of hours of interviewing, is there any story that was told that wasn't able to make it in the 52 chapters? Is something that you think about frequently?
Oof. That's, I mean, are you asking, but I think Bub John would probably have stories that he would want to be in there. I think big part of my process always, especially with the long form stories. Again, there's these two types of work I do. There's the stories that are one chapter that I tell on the streets. I've told thousands of those. Then there's been about 10 or 12 of these long form stories, which are much deeper processes. And with those, there, so much of that is, and then the longer I've been as a writer, it's really the strength of a story is the good stuff that you don't include. The stuff that is amazing but non-essential. So so much of my process, especially in short form, if I was writing a Shahnameh, if I was writing a 500-page novel, obviously I could be more meandering and wander around and explore these. But especially with the medium, for better or worse, that I have been given in life, it's a major battle to keep people's attention, and the medium necessitates a form of writing that I always say is more analogous to screenwriting than it is to actual novel writing, because each chapter is told at a different time, and people have to come back and read the next one. So there needs to be a forward movement and a drive and a thread through it. So a lot of the tricks and the lessons that I've taken have been through studying screenwriters and studying playwrights. And so yeah, the answer is that there's hundreds of great stories that Bub John told me, that I wasn't able to include. And I think him, along with everybody ever write the story about, some of the most important things that they hold most dear to them might not be the things that the story most needed or the story most required.
I have a couple more minutes. Maybe I'll ask one more question, and if there are no others, we can wrap up a bit early. But Brandon, I wonder if you could share a few thoughts about your 2 trips to Iran. I know you went in 2012 and 2015, and what the experience was like as an American, and maybe as you saw.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's kind of a funny story, because it was the first time I ever traveled overseas. When I was in high school, a good friend of mine was Iranian, and I had actually flunked out of school, and I went and lived with him for a couple of weeks, and his mother, who just passed away, I just went to her funeral, Bejat Alazadeh. I'm still working on my Persian pronunciations. She was giving me, books about the Persian mystics, and it was really kind of the first moment that I was really introduced to Iran. And when Humans of New York really started getting big, for those of you who are not aware of it, I was a photographer trying to make it in New York, and suddenly social media came, and it just really clicked, and it blew up, and suddenly there were millions of people reading, every story that I wrote. And I wanted to attempt to take it overseas. And again, for the same reason that I described, the work that I was really starting to take pride in was the work that showed a side of a place through the voices of the people who lived there that was most opposed or separated from the stories and the narratives that were coming out about that place that people were seeing. And Iran, the movie Argo, had just come out. So Iran was on people's minds. I think it was a front runner for Best Picture when I went over there. But in this format of the white man, the CIA going over there to save people from the fanatics. And so to go over there, and I'll admit, like I hadn't at that point done a lot of foreign travel. And so I remember being on the plane. I knew nothing. The way that the travel worked, I didn't have a journalism permit, or I'm just a guy with a camera. I did not do this the right way. I was flying a plane, and I remember just going over, and it was in the middle of the night, and I could see the flames from some oil fields, and I just like had my entire imagination to go like, what am I about to find? So I had no idea. I had to have a government minder stay with me the entire time. And they were going to be, the government minders, too strong of a word, a government certified tour guide. All I knew was his name was Muhammad. That's all I knew, is that I was meeting a man, Muhammad. I didn't have a translator in my plan. And so I remember I was so nervous. I was like, "Oh, his name's Muhammad. He's probably going to be on the radical side of things, not radical side, conservative side of things. And he's not gonna want me to photograph people because they had no idea. Like I signed up for a private tour of Iran, and I was just planning on going there and ditching and telling my tour guide, actually, I just want to stop random people. And when I got there, I remember Muhammad came up to me and he told me he had to go take a nap in the prayer room because he was hungover. And I was like, oh man. I know. And I said, oh man, this is gonna work. This is gonna work. So I asked the guy, I told him, I explained to him, I said, I'm a blogger, I run this website. And he was like, okay, I'll help you. He got into it. And so this guy served as my interpreter. And we just started stopping random people on the streets. Everyone was so nice. In New York, 50% of people will tell me no, 50%. In Tehran, I think I probably stopped 100 people, maybe 3 or 4 people said no. That was when I really first started getting introduced to the idea of Eastern hospitality, Islamic hospitality, hospitality in the entire Middle East, which I would run into over and over again as I travel to more Middle Eastern countries. Where in the West, it's more of an imposition to ask somebody for their time, but in the East, it's more on the person to make somebody feel welcome. The energy is towards the guest as opposed to the energy being, a selfish or independent one. And so I started getting these beautiful photos of these random people on the streets of Iran. I was 26 years old, didn't have a journalism degree or didn't have any credentials. And while I was there, it started going viral in the country. It was one of the most exciting things in my life. And so at the end of like 7 days, people were coming up to me all over Iran saying, oh, I'm sorry, because Facebook was banned. It was mainly on Facebook back then, but everybody was using the VPNs. And so everybody in the country was kind of following along while I was doing it. And then it got a little nerve-wracking in the end. I was starting to get some emails from people saying that the conservative blogs were saying that I shouldn't be photographing women. There was a problem with me photographing women. But then I left, and it was just such a special experience for all the reasons that I hoped it would be. Because back then, those pictures, that very first trip, millions and millions and millions and millions of people were looking at it, and it was for a lot of them the first images they'd seen of just normal, beautiful life in Iran. People going on dates, people reading poetry to each other, people, trying to teach generosity to their children, as opposed to death to America, death to America, death to America. And that's why I fell in love with the country. And, here we are. I'm still thinking about it 15 years later.
Thank you. Okay, sounds one last question maybe.
Thanks so much for everyone being here today. My question is for you, Brandon, as well. You've been so privileged to get to know the insides of people's minds and their lives through, the many, many interviews you've had. And I'm sure, you're it's very clear, contemplative guy, somebody who looks inside and thinks very deeply about what's going on. I'm sure there's some common themes that have come up in a lot of the dark stories that have arisen. And I'm curious if you've extracted any life lessons from how people are able to get through hard times in the interviews you've had.
I'm working on my next book, and I'm kind of going back and looking at all my early work, and I'm asking myself those same questions that you just asked me, like, because I normally am so focused on, like, almost going back to Kevin's questions. Part of my process is that I have to completely clear my mind with every new person. I can't be thinking about humanity as a whole, or the ways that we're all the same. I just have to understand how this person is different than everyone else. And so, going back and looking at all 10,000 and looking at the common themes and the common threads, has something that I've never put a lot of energy into until recently, as I'm trying to kind of ask these questions about, what did I learn from these 10,000 conversations? And one thing that, comes to my mind, one thing I talk with my wife, it goes back to that question of, what is your greatest struggle, and how a lot of times people, no matter how deep their hardships are, if they have something to fight for, if they have something that motivates them, that they have something that they are living for, they're going to have a more fulfilled life and a deeper sense of self than somebody who has all the money and all the resources in the world but has nothing to live for. And so just seeing how people are strengthened by their struggles, strengthened by their battles. They take power from them, and they grow from them. It's just really, because that's what a story is. You know, a story is a person pushing against circumstances, or pushing against some sort of conflict, or pushing against some sort of opponent, and coming out the other side and growing. And so, you know, I think that a lot of times, you know, the people with the biggest sense of pride and the sense of support and the strongest stories to tell were people who from the outside seem to be in the most poverty, or the lowest circumstances. And so, you know, I think one thing that I've learned is that the need to fight for something, to have something that you're fighting for in life, and that somebody in very dire circumstances who's fighting for something can feel that their life is so much more meaningful than somebody with all of their needs taken care of and who's just living a life of pleasure and privilege.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brandon, Mr. Parvizi, Dr. Parvizi, Rostam Parvizi. Thank you, everyone, for being here.